The year was 1886, and Dodge City, Kansas, stood as a testament to America's untamed frontier spirit. Cattle drives thundered through its dusty streets, while saloons echoed with the laughter of cowboys and the clink of poker chips. Yet amidst this chaos of voices, one man remained perpetually silent. They called him the Lonely Rancher, though nobody knew his real name. For 3 years, he had been a fixture in Dodge City, arriving each morning at precisely 7 o'clock to tend his small plot of land on the town's eastern edge. His weathered face, marked by sun and hardship, bore the lines of a man who had seen more than his 43 years should have allowed. His steel-gray eyes held secrets that seemed to weigh heavier than the Kansas sky before a storm. "Hi, how are you? I'm interrupting quickly just to ask you to click on the like button and subscribe to the channel. This will help a lot. Thank you, and I hope you like the story." The townspeople had grown accustomed to his presence, yet remained mystified by his silence. Martha Henderson, who ran the general store, often watched him through her window as he purchased supplies with nothing more than pointing and nodding. "Strange fellow," she would whisper to her customers. "Been here 3 years, and I ain't heard him speak a single word." Sheriff Tom Bradley had tried numerous times to engage the lonely rancher in conversation, particularly when disputes arose over land boundaries or cattle wandering onto his property. Each time, the man would simply tip his worn hat, produce whatever documentation was needed, and resolve matters through gestures and written notes. His handwriting was surprisingly elegant, suggesting an education that seemed at odds with his humble circumstances. The saloon was where the most colorful theories about the lonely rancher emerged. Old Pete, a grizzled prospector who claimed to have known every soul west of the Mississippi, swore the man was a former preacher who had lost his faith. "Seen it before," Pete would declare, nursing his whiskey. "Man of God loses his way, takes a vow of silence as penance." Others whispered darker possibilities. Jake Morrison, a cattle baron with a reputation for ruthlessness, suggested the lonely rancher might be a wanted man hiding from his past. "Silent types always got something to hide," Jake would say, his cold eyes following the rancher whenever their paths crossed. But it was young Timothy Walsh, barely 16 and working as a stable hand, who came closest to the truth. He had noticed how the lonely rancher's eyes would linger on families walking together, how his weathered hands would pause in their work when children's laughter carried on the wind. "I think he's just lonely," Timothy told his mother one evening. "Like he's carrying some terrible sadness." The lonely rancher's daily routine never varied. Dawn would find him checking his small herd of cattle, his movements efficient and purposeful. He maintained his property with meticulous care, every fence post straight, every gate properly latched. His modest cabin, though simple, was always clean and well-maintained. Neighbors noted that he often worked late into the night, as if keeping busy was the only way to quiet whatever demons haunted his thoughts. On Sundays, while the rest of Dodge City gathered at the whitewashed church on Main Street, the lonely rancher could be found sitting on his porch, staring eastward toward the horizon. Reverend Samuel Cooper had attempted several times to invite him to services, but the man would only shake his head politely and retreat into his cabin. The mystery deepened when traveling merchants or new arrivals would occasionally approach the lonely rancher as if recognizing him from somewhere else. These encounters always ended the same way, with the visitors leaving quickly, often looking troubled or confused. When pressed by curious townspeople, these strangers would claim they had mistaken him for someone else. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the town's physician and Jake Morrison's estranged sister, had been called to treat the lonely rancher once when a horse had kicked him. She noted that his body bore numerous old scars, including what appeared to be burn marks on his arms and hands. When she tried to ask about his medical history, he had simply written on a piece of paper, "Old wounds. They've healed." The children of Dodge City were perhaps the most accepting of the lonely rancher's silence. They would wave to him as they passed his property on their way to school, and he would always wave back, sometimes even managing a small smile. Little Sarah Bennett, only 6 years old, had once approached his fence to show him a wildflower she had picked. The lonely rancher had knelt down to her level, examining the flower with such gentle attention that Sarah's mother, watching from a distance, felt her heart soften toward the mysterious man. As autumn painted the Kansas plains in shades of gold and crimson, the lonely rancher's silence had become as much a part of Dodge City as the cattle pens and the railroad depot. People had stopped expecting him to speak, had stopped wondering why he chose solitude over companionship. His presence was simply accepted, like the wind that swept across the prairie or the stars that wheeled overhead each night. But change was coming to Dodge City, carried on the wheels of a westbound train that would arrive on a storm-lashed evening in late October. Aboard that train was someone whose very presence would shatter the lonely rancher's carefully constructed world of silence, forcing him to confront a past he had spent 3 years trying to forget. The townspeople of Dodge City had no way of knowing that their quiet, mysterious neighbor was about to become the center of the most extraordinary story their frontier town had ever witnessed. They could not have imagined that the man who had never spoken a word in their presence was about to find his voice in the most unexpected and heart-wrenching way possible. As the first cold winds of winter began to whistle through the streets of Dodge City, the stage was set for a revelation that would challenge everything the townspeople thought they knew about justice, family, and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. The storm struck Dodge City with the fury of nature unleashed. Rain lashed against the windows of the Silver Dollar Saloon as thunder rolled across the prairie like cannon fire. Inside, the usual crowd of cowboys, merchants, and drifters huddled around tables, their conversations punctuated by the howling wind that seemed determined to tear the roof from its moorings. Sheriff Tom Bradley sat at his usual corner table, nursing a cup of coffee and watching the storm through rain-streaked windows. "Haven't seen weather like this since the tornado of '83, he remarked to Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, who had taken shelter in the saloon after making her evening rounds. The saloon doors, reinforced with iron bands to withstand countless nights of rowdy cowboys, suddenly burst open with such violence that every conversation stopped mid-sentence. But it wasn't the wind that had forced them apart. It was a small figure silhouetted against the lightning-split sky. A girl, no more than 8 years old, stood in the doorway like an apparition conjured by the storm itself. Her clothes were torn and mud-stained, her dark hair plastered to her head by the rain. She was barefoot, her small feet bleeding from what must have been miles of walking across rough terrain. But it was her eyes that captured everyone's attention. Large, dark, and filled with a determination that seemed impossible for someone so young and obviously traumatized. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," whispered Martha Henderson, who had been waiting out the storm with a glass of sherry. "Where did that child come from?" The girl's gaze swept across the room, taking in the shocked faces of Dodge City's residents. Her breathing was labored, and she swayed slightly on her feet, clearly exhausted beyond measure. Yet she remained standing, as if sheer willpower was the only thing keeping her upright. Then, as if guided by some invisible force, her eyes found their target. In the far corner of the saloon, partially hidden in shadow, sat the lonely rancher. He had been quietly nursing a single glass of whiskey, as was his custom on the rare occasions when the weather drove him to seek shelter among the townspeople. The moment their eyes met, something extraordinary happened. The girl's face, which had been a mask of exhaustion and fear, suddenly transformed. Relief, joy, and desperate hope flooded her features as recognition dawned. Without hesitation, she ran across the saloon floor, her bare feet slapping against the wooden boards. "Pa!" she cried, her voice cutting through the stunned silence like a bell. "Pa! I found you!" The effect on the room was electric. Every person present felt their breath catch as the impossible unfolded before their eyes. The lonely rancher, the man who had never spoken a word in 3 years, whose silence had become legendary throughout Dodge City, slowly rose from his chair. His weathered face had gone pale, and his hands trembled as the girl threw herself into his arms. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, he simply held her, his eyes closed as if he were afraid she might disappear if he opened them. "Emma," he whispered, and the sound of his voice, deep, rough from disuse, but unmistakably filled with love, sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. "My sweet Emma, how did you find me?" The girl, Emma, pulled back to look at his face, her small hands framing his weathered cheeks. "I never stopped looking, Pa. I knew you were alive. I knew you'd come back for me someday, but I couldn't wait anymore. I had to find you." Jake Morrison was the first to recover from the shock. "Now hold on just a minute," he said, rising from his table with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "We don't know who this child is or where she came from. For all we know, she's just some runaway looking for a meal and a warm place to sleep." The lonely rancher's head turned toward Morrison, and for the first time in 3 years, the townspeople saw fire in those steel-gray eyes. "This is my daughter," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Emma Catherine Thornton. She's been missing for 3 years." "Thornton?" Dr. Morrison leaned forward, her medical training making her naturally observant. "I thought your name was—" "My name is Samuel Thornton," the lonely rancher continued, never taking his eyes off Morrison. "And this is my daughter. She was taken from me in a fire that destroyed our home in Lawrence, Kansas. I was told she was dead." The revelation sent murmurs rippling through the crowd. Lawrence, Kansas, everyone knew that name. It was where Quantrill's raiders had struck during the war, leaving death and destruction in their wake. But that had been over 20 years ago. Emma looked up at her father with eyes that held wisdom far beyond her years. "The fire wasn't an accident, Pa. Uncle Marcus said it. He wanted the land, and he wanted you gone. He told everyone you were dead, and he told me you had abandoned me." Sheriff Bradley stepped forward, his lawman's instincts taking over. "Now, little miss, that's a serious accusation you're making. Marcus Thornton is a respected businessman in Lawrence. He owns half the county. He's a liar and a murderer," Emma said with quiet conviction. "He killed Mama, and he tried to kill Pa. When the fire started, I hid in the root cellar like Pa taught me. I saw Uncle Marcus talking to the men who set the fire. I heard him say Pa was supposed to die in the flames." Samuel Thornton's face had hardened into a mask of controlled rage. "Marcus always wanted the ranch. Our father left it to me, and Marcus never forgave that. But I never thought he would." His voice trailed off as he looked down at his daughter. "Emma, how did you escape? How did you survive?" "Uncle Marcus sent me to live with the Sisters of Mercy in Topeka," Emma explained. "He told them you were dead and that he couldn't care for me. But I knew he was lying. I could see it in his eyes. So I ran away. I've been searching for you for months, going from town to town, asking if anyone had seen a man who looked like you." Old Pete, who had been listening with growing amazement, suddenly snapped his fingers. "That's why you looked familiar when you first came to town. You got the same eyes as your little girl here. Same stubborn set to your jaw, too." Dr. Morrison approached slowly, her physician's instincts overriding the drama of the moment. "Child, you're exhausted and injured. Let me take a look at those cuts on your feet." But Emma shrank back against her father. "I'm not leaving Pa again. I won't let anyone take me away from him." Samuel's arms tightened protectively around his daughter. "No one is taking you anywhere, Emma. I promise you that." Jake Morrison's voice cut through the tender moment like a blade. "Now see here, Thornton. If that's even your real name, you can't just waltz back into society after 3 years of playing mute and expect us to believe some wild story about fires and murders. For all we know, you kidnapped this child yourself." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Samuel Thornton stood slowly, his daughter still in his arms, and faced the man who had just challenged his integrity. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had found his purpose again. "Mr. Morrison, I understand your skepticism, but I give you my word as a father and as a man that every word my daughter has spoken is the truth, and I intend to prove it." The morning after the storm brought an uneasy calm to Dodge City. Word of the previous night's dramatic revelation had spread through the town like wildfire, and by sunrise, clusters of residents gathered on street corners, their conversations hushed but intense. The lonely rancher, now revealed as Samuel Thornton, had taken his daughter to Dr. Morrison's clinic, where she could receive proper medical attention and a safe place to rest. Sheriff Bradley arrived at the clinic just as Dr. Morrison finished treating Emma's wounded feet. The little girl sat on the examination table, her legs swinging freely, while her father stood guard beside her like a sentinel. The transformation in Samuel was remarkable. Gone was the withdrawn, silent figure the town had known. In his place stood a man with purpose, his eyes alert and protective. "Mr. Thornton," Sheriff Bradley began carefully, "I need to ask you some questions about what happened last night. These are serious allegations your daughter has made." Samuel nodded grimly. "I understand, Sheriff, but before we discuss the past, I need to know that Emma is safe. My brother Marcus has considerable influence in Kansas. If he learns she's alive and has found me—" "Pa," Emma interrupted, reaching for her father's hand. "Tell him about the papers. The ones Mama hid." Dr. Morrison looked up from cleaning her instruments. "What papers?" Emma's young voice carried a weight that seemed impossible for her age. "Before the fire, Mama knew something bad was going to happen. She heard Uncle Marcus talking to some men about making Pa disappear so he could claim the ranch. She hid important papers in a special place and told me where to find them if anything ever happened to her and Pa." Samuel's face darkened. "What papers, Emma? What did your mother hide?" "Uncle Marcus's real business papers," Emma said. "The ones that show he's been stealing money from the bank in Lawrence. Mama said he owed bad men a lot of money, and the only way he could pay them back was by selling our ranch." Sheriff Bradley leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "Where are these papers now?" Emma looked at her father uncertainly. "I hid them before I ran away from the convent. They're in a safe place, but I can only get them if we go back to Kansas." "Absolutely not," Samuel said firmly. "I won't risk your safety by returning to Lawrence. Marcus has too much power there." Dr. Morrison had been listening intently, and now she spoke up. "Samuel, if what Emma says is true, those papers could clear your name and expose your brother's crimes. But she's right. You can't go back to Lawrence. Marcus would have you killed before you could reach the sheriff." "Then what do you suggest?" Samuel asked. Before Dr. Morrison could answer, the clinic door burst open. Jake Morrison strode in, his face flushed with anger and determination. Behind him came two men that Samuel didn't recognize. Well-dressed strangers with hard eyes and the unmistakable bearing of hired guns. "Well, well," Jake said with a cold smile. "Looks like our mysterious rancher has quite a story to tell. These gentlemen here have been looking for you, Thornton. Seems there's a reward out for your capture." One of the strangers stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Samuel Thornton, you're wanted for questioning in connection with the murder of your wife and the disappearance of your daughter. We're here to take you back to Lawrence." Emma gasped and pressed closer to her father. "They're lying! Uncle Marcus sent them." "The child is obviously confused," the second stranger said smoothly. "She's been through a terrible ordeal. We're here to reunite her with her loving uncle, who's been searching for her ever since she ran away from the convent." Sheriff Bradley stood up slowly, his hand moving to his own weapon. "Now, hold on there, gentlemen. This is my jurisdiction, and I haven't seen any official warrants or documentation." The first stranger produced a folded paper from his coat. "Here's all the authorization we need, Sheriff. Signed by the territorial judge in Lawrence." As Sheriff Bradley examined the document, Samuel's mind raced. He could see the trap closing around him and Emma. Marcus had clearly been planning this for a long time, using his influence to create false charges and hire men to track them down. "Pa," Emma whispered urgently, "the papers I hid, they're not in Kansas." Samuel looked down at his daughter in surprise. "What do you mean?" "I lied about where they were," Emma said, her voice barely audible. "I was scared someone might be listening. The papers are here, in Dodge City. I hid them when I first arrived before I went to the saloon." Dr. Morrison caught the exchange and smoothly moved to block the stranger's view of Emma. "Sheriff, I need to examine this child more thoroughly. She may have internal injuries from her ordeal." "The girl comes with us," the first stranger said firmly. "We have orders to bring both of them back immediately." "Over my dead body," Samuel said quietly, and something in his tone made everyone in the room go very still. Jake Morrison laughed harshly. That can be arranged, Thornton. You've been living under false pretenses in our town for 3 years. For all we know, you really did murder your wife. I loved my wife more than life itself, Samuel said, his voice rising with emotion. And I would die before I let anyone harm my daughter. Sheriff Bradley looked up from the document, his expression troubled. This warrant appears to be legitimate, but something doesn't feel right about this whole situation. Emma suddenly slipped down from the examination table and ran to the window. Pa, there are more men outside. They've surrounded the building. Samuel moved to the window and cursed under his breath. At least 6 armed men had positioned themselves around the clinic, cutting off any escape routes. Marcus had planned this operation with military precision. It seems your brother wants to make sure there are no loose ends this time, Dr. Morrison observed grimly. The first stranger smiled coldly. Mr. Thornton, you can come quietly, or we can do this the hard way. Either way, you and the girl are coming with us. Samuel looked at his daughter, then at Sheriff Bradley, and finally at Dr. Morrison. In that moment, he made a decision that would change everything. Emma, do you remember what I taught you about being brave? Emma nodded, her young face set with determination. Sometimes being brave means trusting other people to help you. That's right, Samuel said. He turned to Sheriff Bradley. Sheriff, I'm placing my daughter in your protective custody. Whatever happens to me, please don't let them take her. Now wait just a minute. Jake Morrison started to protest. No, you wait, Samuel interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had nothing left to lose. Emma, tell the sheriff where you hid those papers. Emma looked at the strangers, then at Jake Morrison, and finally at Sheriff Bradley. They're hidden in the old church bell tower, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked behind the beam on the north side. The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. If Emma was telling the truth, those papers could expose not just Marcus Thornton's crimes, but potentially implicate others who had helped him cover up his misdeeds. The first stranger's hand moved toward his gun. I think we've heard enough fairy tales for one day. But Sheriff Bradley was already moving, his own weapon drawn and pointed at the strangers. I think we need to take a look at those papers before anyone goes anywhere. The tension in Dr. Morrison's clinic was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sheriff Bradley kept his gun trained on the 2 strangers while Samuel positioned himself protectively in front of Emma. Outside, the sound of boots on wooden sidewalks indicated that the armed men were growing restless. Dr. Morrison, Sheriff Bradley said without taking his eyes off the strangers, I need you to take Emma and slip out the back. Go to the church and retrieve those papers she mentioned. I'm not leaving my father, Emma said firmly, her small chin jutting out with stubborn determination. Emma, Samuel knelt down to her level. Remember what I told you about being brave? Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is trust good people to help you. Dr. Morrison is a good person. Dr. Morrison stepped forward, extending her hand to Emma. Come with me, child. We'll get those papers and prove your father's innocence. The first stranger laughed coldly. You're all making a big mistake. Marcus Thornton is a respected businessman. He's offering a substantial reward for the safe return of his brother and niece. Funny thing about rewards, Sheriff Bradley mused. They usually increase when someone's desperate to keep the truth buried. As Dr. Morrison and Emma slipped out the clinic's back door, Jake Morrison stepped closer to the strangers. Maybe we should listen to these men, Sheriff. They have proper documentation. Samuel studied Jake Morrison's face and suddenly understood. You're working with my brother, aren't you, Morrison? That's why you were so quick to discredit Emma's story last night. Jake's face flushed red. That's a serious accusation, Thornton. Is it? Samuel's voice was steady, but his eyes burned with anger. How else would Marcus know exactly where to find me? I've been careful to leave no trail, use no real name. But you've been watching me for 3 years, haven't you? Reporting back to my brother. The second stranger shifted nervously. We don't have time for this. The girl could be destroying evidence right now. What evidence? Sheriff Bradley asked sharply. If Marcus Thornton is innocent, what does he have to fear from some papers hidden by a frightened child? Before anyone could answer, the clinic door opened, and Timothy Walsh, the young stable hand, burst in. Sheriff, there's a whole army of armed men surrounding the church. They're trying to stop Dr. Morrison and the little girl from getting inside. Samuel's face went white. "Emma's in danger." "Not if I can help it," Sheriff Bradley said grimly. He turned to the strangers. "You two are staying right here under guard. Timothy, run and get Deputy Carson. Tell him to bring every available man." As Timothy rushed out, Samuel made a decision. "Sheriff, I'm going to help my daughter." "You're not going anywhere," the first stranger said, drawing his gun. But Samuel was already moving. Years of ranch work had kept him strong and quick, and the stranger wasn't prepared for the desperate fury of a father protecting his child. Samuel tackled the man, sending his gun skittering across the floor. The second stranger drew his weapon, but Sheriff Bradley was faster. "Drop it or I'll drop you." Jake Morrison backed toward the door. "This is madness. You're all going to regret interfering with official business." "The only thing I regret," Samuel said as he secured the first stranger's gun, "is not seeing through your act sooner, Morrison." Meanwhile, at the old church, Dr. Morrison and Emma had managed to slip inside through a side entrance. The church bell tower was accessible through a narrow wooden ladder, and Emma climbed it with the agility of youth while Dr. Morrison kept watch below. "I found them," Emma called down softly. She descended carefully, clutching a wrapped bundle to her chest. Dr. Morrison quickly examined the contents. Even in the dim light, she could see that the papers were explosive. Bank records showing systematic embezzlement, correspondence between Marcus Thornton and known criminals, and most damning of all, a detailed plan to eliminate Samuel and claim his property. "These papers prove everything you said, Emma. Your uncle is not just a thief. He's a murderer." As they prepared to leave the church, they heard voices outside. Marcus's men had discovered their location and were moving to surround the building. "Dr. Morrison," Emma whispered, "there's another way out. The old tunnel that connects the church basement to the schoolhouse. Pa showed it to me once when we visited Dodge City years ago." They made their way to the basement, where Emma led Dr. Morrison to a concealed entrance behind the coal bin. The tunnel was narrow and dark, but it provided a safe passage away from the armed men. Back at the clinic, Samuel and Sheriff Bradley had secured their prisoners when Deputy Carson arrived with reinforcements. "Sheriff," Carson reported, "we've got at least a dozen armed men in town. They're not from around here. They're Marcus Thornton's hired guns," Samuel explained. "My brother will stop at nothing to silence Emma and me." Just then, Dr. Morrison and Emma emerged from the schoolhouse across the street. Emma ran toward the clinic, clutching the bundle of papers, while Dr. Morrison signaled that they had succeeded. "Pa!" Emma called as she reached the clinic. "We got them! We got the papers that prove Uncle Marcus is the real criminal." Samuel swept his daughter into his arms, relief flooding his face. "Thank God you're safe." Sheriff Bradley examined the documents that Dr. Morrison handed him. His expression grew increasingly grim as he read. "These papers are enough to hang Marcus Thornton and half his associates. Emma, you've been incredibly brave." The first stranger, now securely bound, spoke up desperately. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. Marcus Thornton has connections all the way to the territorial capital. He'll destroy this whole town if you interfere with his business." "Let him try," Sheriff Bradley said firmly. "We have the evidence now, and we have witnesses. Justice will be served." Jake Morrison, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly made a break for the door. But Timothy Walsh, who had been standing guard outside, tackled him before he could escape. "Looks like Mr. Morrison was more involved in this conspiracy than we thought," Dr. Morrison observed. As the sun set over Dodge City, the truth finally came to light. The papers Emma had hidden contained not only evidence of Marcus Thornton's crimes, but also proof that he had been running a criminal enterprise that stretched across 3 states. Jake Morrison had been his local contact, feeding him information about potential targets and helping to cover up his activities. Samuel Thornton was completely exonerated, and warrants were issued for Marcus Thornton's arrest. The territorial marshal was notified, and within days, Marcus and his remaining associates were captured. Emma's courage in preserving the evidence and finding her father had not only reunited their family, but had exposed a criminal conspiracy that had been operating for years. The people of Dodge City, who had once viewed the lonely rancher with suspicion and curiosity, now saw him as a hero who had suffered greatly, but never lost his integrity. 6 months later, Samuel and Emma Thornton had built a new life in Dodge City. Samuel's ranch prospered, and he became an active member of the community. Emma attended the local school and quickly became beloved by everyone who met her. The man who had once been known as the Lonely Rancher was lonely no more. He had found his voice, reclaimed his name, and most importantly, been reunited with the daughter who had never stopped believing in him. On quiet evenings, father and daughter would sit on their porch, watching the sunset paint the Kansas sky in brilliant colors. Emma would tell her father about her day at school, and Samuel would share stories of the ranch and the good people of Dodge City who had helped them find justice. "Pa," Emma said one evening, "do you think Uncle Marcus will ever understand what he did wrong?" Samuel considered the question carefully. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I do know that good people like Sheriff Bradley and Dr. Morrison prove that there's more kindness in the world than cruelty, and that's what matters." As the stars appeared in the darkening sky, Samuel Thornton reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. He had lost his voice for 3 years, silenced by grief and the weight of injustice. But his daughter's love and courage had given him back not just his voice, but his faith in the goodness of humanity. The Lonely Rancher was silent no more, and Dodge City was a better place for it. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel The Best Wild West to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much and come back often.